The frost clung to everything like a disease on Calith's surface. Marcus pulled his thermal coat tighter as he navigated through the skeletal remains of what had once been mining Sector 7. The abandoned colony stretched endlessly beneath, a sky the color of old rust, littered with the bones of extraction equipment and collapsed hab domes. Most salvagers avoided this sector after dark, but Marcus had learned that the best finds came to those willing to venture where others feared to tread. His breath formed small clouds in the bitter air as he followed the faint heat signature his scanner had detected 3 blocks away. Active power sources were rare this far from the main settlement, and rarer still were the kind of people who operated in complete radio silence. Marcus had been scavenging these ruins for 8 years, ever since the mining corporation had abandoned Calith and left its workers stranded. He knew the difference between a forgotten generator and something deliberately hidden. The signal led him to a partially collapsed warehouse. Its roof caved in on one side, but its foundation still solid. Warm light leaked through gaps in the corrugated walls, casting dancing shadows on the frost-covered ground. Marcus crouched behind a pile of rusted mining carts and peered through a crack in the wall. Inside, a crude auction floor had been assembled from salvaged materials. The space was small, maybe 20 meters across, with improvised seating arranged in a semicircle round a raised platform. Several figures sat hunched in heavy coats, their faces obscured by breath masks and goggles. At the center of it all stood a tall man in remarkably clean clothing, his jacket lined with synthetic fur that marked him as someone with off-world connections. The auctioneer gestured toward a series of reinforced cages, arranged along the back wall. Most stood empty, their doors hanging open like broken jaws, but 3 still contained occupants. Marcus felt his stomach clench as he realized what he was witnessing. The slave trade had always existed on the outer colonies, thriving in the spaces between law and civilization. But seeing it firsthand made his hands shake with something between rage and revulsion. 2 of the cages held human prisoners, both men, both bearing the lean look of laborers who had fallen on hard times. They sat in resigned silence, no longer fighting against bonds they couldn't break. But it was the 3rd cage that drew Marcus's attention and held it like a trap. She was clearly not human, though she shared enough similarities to pass at a distance. Her skin held a faint luminescence, pearl white with undertones of silver that seemed to shift in the dim light. Long hair, nearly transparent, fell around her shoulders like spun starlight. She was small, perhaps 5.5 feet tall, but there was nothing fragile about the way she held herself despite her obvious captivity. Metal restraints circled her wrists and ankles, connected by short chains that limited her movement to a few inches in any direction. She wore what had once been a simple tunic, now torn and stained, that revealed the elegant lines of her collarbones and the subtle musculature of her arms. But it was her eyes that stopped Marcus cold, large and dark blue, like deep water under starlight, holding an intelligence that cut through the degradation of her circumstances. The auctioneer's voice drifted through the thin walls as he began his pitch for the first prisoner. Marcus couldn't make out every word, but the tone was familiar. The casual objectification of human beings reduced to their potential labor value. He should leave. He should report this to what passed for colonial security and let them handle it. He should do anything except crouch in the frost like a voyeur, watching people's lives be bought and sold. But he didn't move. The first 2 auctions concluded quickly. The prisoners sold to buyers who paid in untraceable credit chips before leading their new property away into the Calith night. Then the auctioneer turned his attention to the 3rd cage, and Marcus found himself leaning closer to the wall despite every instinct telling him to flee. "Now this one's special," the auctioneer announced, his voice carrying clearly in the thin air. "Genuine Charleston hybrid, according to the documentation. Rare as diamonds and twice as pretty. She's been trouble for previous owners, I'll be honest. Doesn't train easy, doesn't break clean. But look at that bone structure, that skin quality. Even if you can't tame her for service, the exotic meat market pays premium for this kind of genetics." Marcus felt bile rise in his throat as murmurs of interest rippled through the small crowd. The woman in the cage raised her head slightly, and for a moment their eyes met through the gap in the wall. She couldn't possibly see him in the darkness outside, but something in her gaze made him feel exposed, as if she knew exactly where he was and what he was thinking. The bidding started low and climbed slowly. This wasn't the feeding frenzy of a luxury auction. These were practical buyers considering a problematic investment. Marcus counted maybe 6 voices participating, their offers measured and cautious. The price peaked at 400 credits and seemed ready to close, when one of the buyers demanded to examine the merchandise more closely. The auctioneer shrugged and opened the cage door. "Keep it brief. I want to wrap this up before the patrol." Schedules shift. The buyer, a heavy-set man in a patched environment suit, stepped forward and grabbed the woman's chin with a gloved hand, turning her head left and right as if inspecting livestock. She submitted to the examination without resistance, but Marcus could see the tension in her shoulders, the careful way she controlled her breathing. "Teeth look good," the buyer announced. "What about temperament? I don't want something that's going to require constant sedation. She's been cooperative enough." The auctioneer replied, "A few days without food tends to improve anyone's attitude." The buyer's hand moved to her throat, checking her pulse or perhaps just asserting dominance. That's when she spoke, her voice so quiet Marcus almost missed it despite the warehouse's acoustic properties. "Please," she whispered, the word carrying across the frozen air like a prayer. "I don't want to die here." The buyer jerked his hand back as if burned. "It talks." "They all talk," the auctioneer said dismissively. "Doesn't mean they're saying anything worth hearing." But Marcus heard. He heard the desperation beneath the dignity, the way she'd shaped the words carefully despite her obvious exhaustion. He heard intelligence and fear and a desperate hope that someone, somewhere, might choose to see her as more than meat or property. The auction resumed, but Marcus was no longer listening to the bidding. He was counting the credits in his emergency fund, calculating whether he had enough to make this insane, impossible gesture that would change everything about his carefully ordered life. The price hit 500 credits. Going once, Marcus stood up, his legs unsteady beneath him. Going twice. He walked around to the warehouse's main entrance, his heart hammering against his ribs. 600, he called out as he stepped into the light, interrupting the auctioneer's closing call. Every head in the warehouse turned toward him. The woman in the cage lifted her eyes to his face, and this time he was certain she could see him. Her expression didn't change, but something shifted behind her gaze, a spark of something that might have been hope. Well, the auctioneer smiled. "Fresh blood. You sure you know what you're getting into, friend?" Marcus pulled out his credit chip and held it up. 600. Final offer. The auctioneer's smile widened. "Sold." 20 minutes later, Marcus found himself standing in the bitter Caliph night with a woman he'd just purchased like a piece of salvage. She walked beside him in silence, still chained, still barefoot on the frozen ground. He draped his spare coat over her shoulders, but she moved carefully, testing each step on the treacherous surface. They were halfway back to his shelter when she spoke again, her voice still barely above a whisper. Why? Marcus didn't slow his pace, but he glanced at her walking form. "I don't know," he answered honestly. "I couldn't just watch." She nodded slightly, as if this made perfect sense to her. They continued walking through the ruins of Sector 7, to strangers bound together by a moment of impulse that neither fully understood. Yet, behind them, the warehouse had already gone dark, its temporary purpose fulfilled. But ahead, in the distance, Marcus's shelter glowed with the promise of warmth and safety, and the beginning of something neither of them could yet name. Marcus's shelter occupied the upper floors of what had once been a colonial administration building. The lower levels had flooded years ago when the geothermal regulators failed, but the third floor remained dry and defensible. He'd spent months reinforcing the walls with salvaged insulation and rigging a heating system from repurposed mining equipment. It wasn't luxurious, but it was warm and secure and, most importantly, invisible to anyone who didn't know exactly where to look. The woman he still didn't know her name said nothing. As they climbed the emergency stairs, her chains clinked, softly with each step, a metallic counterpoint to their breathing in the confined space. Marcus had fashioned a makeshift key from a piece of bent wire during the walk back. but he hadn't dared use it yet. Trust, he'd learned during his years alone, was something that had to be earned gradually. The main room was sparse but functional. A sleeping area separated by hanging thermal blankets occupied one corner, while the opposite wall housed his workbench and tool storage. The center of the space was dominated by a circular heating unit he'd built from a mining lasers. Power core, its gentle hum providing both warmth and white noise. Condensation from the temperature differential had created small gardens of frost on the windows, turning the view outside into abstract patterns of light and shadow. She stood just inside the doorway, taking inventory of her surroundings with the systematic attention of someone who'd learned to assess threats quickly. Her gaze lingered on the exits, the tools within reach, the blind spots where someone could hide. Only after completing this survey did she look directly at him. "What happens now?" she asked. Marcus set his salvage pack down beside the workbench and began removing his outer layers. "Now you get warm, you eat something. We figure out the rest tomorrow." He gestured toward the heating unit. "You can sit anywhere you're comfortable. I'm going to prepare some food." She moved to the far side of the heater, positioning herself where she could watch both him and the door simultaneously. The chains made sitting awkward, so she remained standing, his coat still draped over her shoulders like armor against uncertainty. Marcus activated his small cooking unit and began preparing a meal. From his emergency rations, the process gave him something to do with his hands while his mind raced through the implications of what he'd done. 600 credits represented nearly 3 months of careful salvaging. His food stores would now have to feed to people instead of one. And somewhere in the colony's data networks, a transaction record existed that connected him to the underground slave trade. But watching her gradual relaxation as the room's warmth reached her, seeing the way her rigid posture softened by degrees, he found he couldn't regret the impulse that had brought her here. "What's your name?" he asked as he divided the heated rations between the containers. "NYX," she replied after a moment's hesitation. "I'm Marcus." He approached slowly, offering her one of the containers along with a simple eating utensil. "The food isn't much, but it's better than whatever they were giving you." She accepted the meal carefully, ensuring their fingers didn't touch during the exchange. The first bite was tentative, testing for drugs or adulterants. The second was hungrier. By the third, she was eating with the focused intensity of someone who hadn't seen real food in days. Marcus ate his own portion while stealing glances at her. Up close, the alien aspects of her heritage were more pronounced. Her ears came to subtle points, and her skin held that pearl-like luminescence even in artificial light. But it was her movements that truly marked her as non-human to fluid, to precise, as if she operated according to slightly different laws of physics. "How long were you in that cage?" he asked when she'd finished eating. 3 days, maybe 4. She set the empty container aside and touched the restraints around her wrists. "Time becomes difficult to measure." Marcus reached into his tool kit and withdrew the improvised key he'd fashioned. "May I?" Nyx extended her hands without hesitation, though he noticed she kept her weight balanced on the balls of her feet, ready to move if necessary. The locks were simple mechanisms, designed more for intimidation than security. Within minutes, the chains fell away with metallic clatters that seemed to louden the shelter's quiet atmosphere. She rubbed her wrists where the metal had chafed, revealing skin that was raw but already beginning to heal with inhuman speed. For the first time since entering the shelter, she seemed to truly relax, her shoulders dropping and her breathing deepening. "Thank you," she said simply. Marcus nodded and began clearing away the meal containers. "There's a wash station behind that partition if you want to clean up. Water's heated, and there are clean clothes in the storage locker. Nothing fancy, but it's all been sterilized." She rose and moved toward the indicated area, then paused at the threshold. "You're not going to watch?" The question caught him off guard. "No. Why would I?" "Because you own me now." Her voice was matter of fact, without bitterness or accusation. "That's how this works." Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach. "I don't own you. I bought you away from people who would have hurt you, but that doesn't make you my property." Nyx tilted her head slightly, studying his face with those deep blue eyes. "Then, what am I? He struggled for words. You're someone who needs a safe place to figure out what comes next, that's all." She considered this for a long moment, then disappeared behind the partition. Marcus heard the sound of running water and tried not to think about the woman bathing just a few meters away. Instead, he busied himself with preparing the sleeping area, hanging additional thermal blankets to create privacy and retrieving extra bedding from his storage supplies. When she emerged 20 minutes later, she was transformed, clean and dressed, in his spare clothing thermal pants that were too long for her legs and a work shirt that hung loose on her smaller frame. She looked younger and somehow more fragile. Her wet hair caught the heater's glow like captured starlight. "The bed's ready," Marcus said, indicating the sleeping area. "I'll take the floor tonight. You don't have to do that." "Yes, I do." He met her gaze steadily. "You've been through enough. You need rest, real rest, without worrying about what I might expect in return." Nyx's expression shifted, something vulnerable flickering across her features before she masked it again. "You're not what I expected." "What did you expect? Someone who would take what they paid for?" She moved toward the sleeping area, then paused. "Most humans do," the casual way she said it, as if sexual exploitation were simply another weather pattern to endure, made Marcus's chest tighten with anger, not at her, but at the systems and people who had taught her such lessons. "Not all of us," he said quietly. She nodded and slipped behind the thermal blankets. Marcus heard the soft sounds of her settling into the bedding, followed by a sigh that seemed to release weeks of accumulated tension. He dimmed the lighting and arranged his own sleeping materials near the heater, far enough from her area to provide privacy but close enough to respond if she needed help during the night. The floor was harder than his usual bed, but the discomfort seemed appropriate somehow. A small price to pay for the knowledge that she could sleep without fear. Hours passed. The shelter's heating system cycled through its programmed routine, maintaining optimal temperature while outside the Caliph wind howled through the colony ruins. Marcus lay awake, listening to Nyx's breathing gradually deepen and slow. Occasionally she would murmur something in a language he didn't recognize, dream words in what might have been her native tongue. Near dawn, he heard her crying soft, nearly silent sobs that she tried to muffle in the bedding. He wanted to offer comfort, but instinct told him that acknowledgement would only embarrass her. Instead, he remained still and let her grieve privately for whatever she had lost or left behind. When morning light finally filtered through the frosted windows, Marcus woke to find breakfast already prepared and waiting on the table. Nyx sat beside the heater, fully dressed, her hair braided back in a complex pattern that revealed the elegant line of her neck. "You didn't have to cook," he said, accepting the container of heated rations. "I wanted to contribute something." She paused. "I don't know how to be useless." Marcus studied her face, noting the careful way she held herself, the subtle tension that suggested she was prepared for criticism or rejection. "You're not useless. You're recovering." They ate in comfortable silence, sharing the space like two people who had known each other longer than a single night. Outside, the wind was dying down, promising clearer weather ahead. But inside the shelter, surrounded by warmth and the beginning of something that might eventually become trust, the storm felt very far away. When they finished eating, Nyx began cleaning the containers without being asked. Marcus watched her efficient movements and realized that somewhere during the night, his shelter had stopped feeling like a solitary refuge and started feeling like a home. The storm that arrived 3 days later was unlike anything Marcus had experienced in his 8 years on Caliph. The wind didn't just howl, it screamed through the colony ruins, with a voice that seemed almost alive, rattling the reinforced walls of the shelter and turning the outside world into a whirling chaos of ice and darkness. The temperature dropped so far that frost began forming on the inside surfaces of the windows. Despite the heating system running at maximum capacity, Nyx stood at the main window, watching the blizzard with an expression Marcus couldn't read. She'd been quieter since the second day, helping with daily tasks, but speaking only when necessary. He caught her sometimes staring at nothing, her eyes distant and unfocused, as if she were looking at scenes that existed only in memory. "It's beautiful," she said suddenly, her breath fogging the glass. "Terrible, but beautiful." Marcus joined her at the window, Careful to maintain the respectful distance he'd learned she preferred. Outside, the storm had transformed the colony ruins into an alien landscape of sculptural ice and shifting shadows. Where I come from, weather like this means death. But here, with walls around us and heat at our backs, it's almost peaceful. Where do you come from? The question seemed to surprise her as much as it did him. She'd avoided personal topics since arriving, deflecting his gentle inquiries with practiced skill. A moon called Besha, in the outer reach, agricultural colony. Mostly my family grew protein crops for the trading stations. Marcus settled into one of the chairs he'd positioned near the window. Not very exciting, but it was home. Nix moved away from the window and sat across from him, drawing her knees up to her chest in a gesture that made her look younger and more vulnerable. What brought you here? The promise of better work. Independent salvage operations can be lucrative if you're willing to go places other people won't. He smiled ruefully. I thought I was being adventurous. Turns out I was just being naive. Do you regret it? Marcus considered the question seriously. His life on Calith was lonely, dangerous, and often harsh. He lived in the ruins of someone else's dreams, picking through the debris of a failed colony for scraps valuable enough to trade for survival. By any objective measure, it was a poor exchange for the simple farming life he'd left behind. Ask me again in a few days, he said finally. Nix's expression softened slightly, and for the first time since arriving, she smiled a small, tentative curve of her lips that transformed her entire face. That's a careful answer, it's an honest one. Marcus leaned back in his chair, studying her face in the heater's glow. What about you? What's your story? The smile faded, replaced by the carefully neutral mask she wore when discussing her past. It's not a pleasant story. Most of them aren't, out here. She was quiet for so long that Marcus began to think she wouldn't answer. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the shelter, but inside, the only sounds were the heating system's gentle hum and the soft whisper of their breathing. I was born on a research station, she said finally. My mother was Celestan, my father was human. The research team was studying genetic compatibility between species, looking for ways to create hybrid populations that could survive in extreme environments. Marcus felt his stomach clench as he began to understand the implications. When I was 16, the funding was cut and the station was abandoned. The researchers left, but they took their data with them. Some of us, the successful experiments, were sold to recoup the investment. Her voice remained steady, clinical, as if she were discussing someone else's life. I've had 17 different owners since then. The number hit Marcus like a physical blow. 17. She couldn't be more than 25, which meant, I'm sorry, he said, knowing the words were inadequate. It's not your fault. Nix pulled her knees closer to her chest. Most of them weren't cruel, just practical. I was valuable property, exotic, durable, intelligent enough to perform complex tasks, but property nonetheless. What happened to the others? The other hybrids? Some died, some escaped. A few found owners who were kinder than most. She shrugged. We weren't friends, exactly. It's hard to form attachments when you know you might be separated at any time. Marcus stared at his hands, trying to process the casual way she described a life of systematic dehumanization. Why are you telling me this? Because you asked, and because she hesitated. Because you've been kind to me without expecting payment. That's rare enough to deserve honesty. The storm outside seemed to intensify, as if responding to the weight of her words. Marcus could hear debris striking the walls, fragments of the dead colony flung about by winds that cared nothing for the struggles of the living. What do you want? He asked. If you could have anything, be anything, what would you choose? NYX looked at him with surprise, as if the question had never occurred to her. I don't know. I've never been allowed to want things for myself. Well, you're allowed now. She considered this, her eyes distant. I think I'd like to see the ocean. I've read about oceans in data files, but I've never seen one. All that water, moving without purpose or direction, just because that's its nature. She glanced at him. Is that foolish? No, Marcus said firmly. It's not foolish at all. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the storm transform the world outside their windows Eventually, Nix rose and moved to the small kitchen area, beginning preparations for their evening meal. Marcus remained at the window, but his attention was no longer on the weather. He was thinking about oceans. Later that evening, as they shared a simple dinner by the heater's warmth, Nix asked about his own dreams and disappointments. Marcus found himself talking about things he hadn't discussed in years: his childhood on Mesha, his parents' hopes for his future, the gradual realization that he wasn't cut out for the farming life they'd planned for him. "I wanted to see the galaxy," he admitted. "All those worlds in the databases, all those different ways of living. I thought if I could just get away from everything familiar, I'd figure out who I was supposed to be." "And did you?" Marcus looked around the shelter, taking in the improvised furniture and jury-rigged systems that had become his entire world. "I figured out who I wasn't. That's something, I suppose. Who weren't you? Brave, or smart, or particularly good at anything that mattered?" He met her gaze. "I'm not a hero, Nix. I'm just someone who couldn't walk away when it mattered." "That sounds like heroism to me." "No," he said quietly. "Heroes have plans. They know what they're doing. I just acted on impulse and hoped for the best." Nix leaned forward slightly, her eyes intense. "Do you regret it? Buying me?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications neither of them was ready to fully acknowledge. Marcus realized that his answer would shape everything that came after their tentative friendship. Her fragile sense of safety, the possibility of something deeper growing between them. "No," he said without hesitation. "Whatever happens next, whatever complications arise from this choice, I don't regret keeping you alive." Something shifted in Nix's expression, a subtle softening that suggested walls beginning to crumble. She reached across the small space between them and, for the first time since arriving, deliberately touched him, her fingers brushing against his hand with butterfly lightness. "Thank you," she whispered. Outside, the storm raged with undiminished fury, but inside the shelter, surrounded by warmth and the beginning of genuine trust, Marcus felt as if the weather had already begun to change. The morning Marcus found Nix tending to a collection of small plants by the window. He realized their relationship had shifted into something neither of them had planned, but both seemed to need. She knelt on the floor in a patch of sunlight that had managed to penetrate Calith's perpetually overcast sky, her hands gentle as she adjusted the position of improvised containers that held tiny green shoots. "Where did these come from?" he asked, crouching beside her to examine the makeshift garden. "I found seeds in some of the abandoned storage units," she said, not looking up from her work. "Most were probably dead, but I thought it was worth trying." She gestured to the strongest of the plants, a small specimen with broad leaves that seemed to shimmer in the morning light. "This one is definitely Chelestan in origin. I recognize the leaf structure." Marcus watched her work, noting the care with which she handled each plant, the way her face softened as she spoke about growth and potential. It struck him that this was the first time he'd seen her create rather than simply survive. "My mother taught me about plants," Nix continued, finally meeting his eyes. "Before the research station, before everything else. She said that understanding how things grow was the key to understanding how to live." Smart woman. She was. Nix's smile was sad but genuine. "She would have liked this place, I think. All this potential for new life hidden among the ruins." Over the following weeks, the garden became a focal point of their daily routine. Marcus would wake to find Nix already up, checking water levels and adjusting the plants' positions to catch the optimal amount of light. She spoke to them softly in her native language, words that sounded like music even when he couldn't understand their meaning. The plants weren't the only things growing. Their conversations had become deeper, more personal, stretching late into the evenings as they shared meals and stories by the heater's warmth. Marcus learned about Nix's childhood on the research station, the hybrid children who had been her only family, the gradual realization that their lives were not their own. Nix learned about his parents' farm, his younger sister who had stayed behind to inherit the family business, his guilt at abandoning responsibilities he'd never truly wanted. "Do you think she's happy?" Nix asked one evening, referring to his sister taking over the farm. "I think she's happier than I would have been," Marcus replied. She always understood the work in ways I never could, the patience required, the faith in cycles beyond your control. He glanced at her garden, visible in the dim light from the window. You would understand it too. Maybe. Nix drew her knees up to her chest, a gesture that had become habitual during their evening talks. I liked the idea of putting something into the soil and trusting it to grow. They had developed their own rhythms of domestic life. Nix cooked breakfast while Marcus checked the shelter's systems. Marcus handled repairs and maintenance while Nix organized their supplies and managed their water reclamation. They worked together in comfortable silence during the day, their movements synchronized like partners in a dance. They'd been practicing for years rather than weeks, but it was the small gestures that revealed the depth of what was growing between them. The way Nix would touch Marcus's shoulder when passing behind his chair. The way Marcus would save the best portions of their meals for her without being asked. The careful distance they maintained even as their emotional intimacy deepened. Both aware that physical contact carried weight that neither was ready to fully explore. One evening, as Marcus worked on repairing a malfunctioning air filter, he became aware that Nix was watching him with unusual intensity. When he looked up, she was sitting cross-legged on the floor nearby, her chin resting on her folded hands. "What?" he asked, setting down his tools. "I was just thinking about the auction," she said. "About the moment you spoke up." Marcus felt heat rise in his cheeks. "I don't really remember making a conscious decision. It just happened. That's what I find interesting." Nix tilted her head slightly. "You didn't know me. You had no reason to care what happened to me. But you acted anyway. Anyone would have done the same thing." "No," she said firmly. "They wouldn't have. I was in that cage for 3 days, and dozens of people walked past without seeing me as anything more than merchandise." She paused. "But you looked at me and saw someone worth saving." Marcus didn't know how to respond to that. The truth was, he still didn't fully understand his own motivations that night. The decision to bid had felt less like choice than compulsion, as if some deeper part of himself had recognized something essential in her that demanded protection. "I'm glad I did," he said finally. "So am I." Nix rose and moved to sit beside him on the floor, close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from her skin. "Marcus, yeah? What happens when the weather clears, when travel becomes possible?" Again, the question had been lurking in the back of his mind for days, gaining urgency as the storms grew less frequent and the temperature began its gradual climb toward Calith's brief summer season. Soon, the colony ruins would be navigable again. Traders would return, along with whatever passed for law enforcement in this forgotten corner of the galaxy. "I don't know," he admitted. "What do you want to happen?" Nix was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on her hands. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I want to stay, here, in the shelter, with you." She looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the heater's glow. "If that's what you want to." Marcus felt his heart skip. The careful distance they'd maintained, the respectful boundaries he'd established, all of it suddenly seemed less like protection and more like barriers preventing something beautiful from taking root. "Nix," he said carefully, "you don't owe me anything. You don't have to stay because you feel grateful or because you think it's expected. That's not why I want to stay." She reached out and took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. "I want to stay because for the first time in my life, I feel like I have a choice. And I choose this. I choose you." The simple declaration hit him with unexpected force. Marcus had grown used to thinking of himself as someone who merely survived, who scraped by in the margins of a harsh world without making much impact on anything or anyone. The idea that someone might actually choose him, not out of necessity or obligation, but from genuine desire, was almost too large to accept. "Are you sure?" he asked, instead of answering with words. Nix leaned forward and kissed him, soft and tentative at first, then with growing confidence as he responded. Her lips were warm against his, her skin carrying a faint luminescence that seemed to intensify. With emotion, when they broke apart, both were breathing hard. Marcus reached up to touch her face, his thumb tracing the elegant line of her cheekbone. "I love you," he said, the words escaping before he could second-guess them. Nix's smile was radiant. "I love you too." They made love that night for the first time, slowly and carefully, with a tenderness born of mutual respect and deep affection. Afterward, as they lay entwined in the narrow bed, Marcus felt as if something fundamental had shifted in his understanding of what life could be. "The plants are blooming," Nix whispered against his shoulder. Marcus looked toward the window, where her small garden caught the faint starlight filtering through Calith's clouds. Sure enough, tiny blossoms had appeared on several of the specimens, delicate flowers in shades of blue and silver that seemed to glow with their own inner light. "They're beautiful," he said. "They're ours," Nix replied, and in that simple possessive pronoun. Marcus heard the promise of a future neither of them had dared to imagine just weeks before. Outside, the last winter storm was finally breaking apart, revealing glimpses of clear sky and the distant promise of spring. But inside the shelter, surrounded by growing things and wrapped in the warmth of new love, the season had already changed. The trade arrived on a Tuesday morning, when the spring thaw had finally made the colony's outer sectors navigable again. Marcus was working on expanding their water reclamation system when he heard the distinctive whine of atmospheric engines approaching the settlement. He looked up from his tools to find Nix standing at the window, her body tense with the alertness he'd learned to associate with potential danger. "Ships landing in the old commercial district," she said without turning around. "Single pilot. Craft, probably a merchant runner." Marcus joined her at the window, noting the way she'd positioned herself to observe while remaining hidden from external view. Old habits, he thought, born from years of staying invisible to avoid unwanted attention. "First trader to make it through since the storms," he said. "We could use the supplies." Nix nodded, but her expression remained guarded. "Should we go into the settlement?" It was a fair question. They'd been living in isolation for 2 months, their world reduced to the shelter and its immediate surroundings. The arrival of outsiders represented both opportunity and risk, a chance to acquire needed resources, but also potential exposure to questions they weren't prepared to answer. "Let me go first," Marcus said. "Scout the situation, see who it is, and what they're offering. You can decide if you want to make contact." "We can decide," Nix corrected gently. "This is our home now. We make these choices together." The simple assertion filled Marcus with warmth. Our home, our choices. The pronouns that had once applied only to his solitary existence now encompassed something larger, and infinitely more precious. They prepared carefully for the venture into the settlement, layering protective clothing and checking their small stock of trade goods. Nix had become skilled at altering her appearance to minimize her more exotic features, binding back her luminescent hair and wearing tinted goggles that obscured her unusual eyes. To a casual observer, she might pass for human with interesting, but not impossible genetics. The colony's main square was busier than Marcus had seen it in months. The trader had set up shop in the ruins of what had once been the central marketplace, displaying wares on improvised tables, while a small crowd of settlers examined the available goods. Marcus recognized most of the faces, fellow salvagers, a few remaining mining families, the handful of service workers who kept the settlement's basic infrastructure functional. The trader herself was a surprise. Marcus had expected another hard-faced merchant like the ones who usually served the outer colonies, but this woman was younger, perhaps 30, with the kind of easy smile that suggested genuine pleasure in human interaction. Her ship bore registry marks from the inner systems, and her goods were of noticeably higher quality than the usual salvage and surplus materials that filtered out to places like Calith. "Name's Zara," she announced to the gathered crowd. "I'm running a new trade route through the outer reach, looking to establish regular service to colonies that have been overlooked by the major shipping lines." Marcus felt Nix stiffen beside him. Regular service meant increased attention from the outside galaxy, which could complicate their carefully constructed anonymity. But it also meant access to resources and opportunities that had been absent from their lives for months. They browsed the trader's wares quietly, drawing no special attention. Zara's inventory included fresh food supplies, advanced communication equipment, medical supplies, and even luxury items like books and entertainment media. After months of subsistence living, the abundance was almost overwhelming. "You folks been here long?" Zara asked when they approached her makeshift counter with a selection of goods. Few years. Marcus replied neutrally, independent salvage operation. Good work if you can find it. Zara nodded. I'm always looking for reliable suppliers of rare components. You ever turn up anything unusual in your searches? The question could have been innocent commercial inquiry, or it could have been something else entirely. Marcus chose his words carefully. Depends what you consider unusual. Oh, you know. Zara's smile was friendly, but her eyes were sharp. Alien tech, hybrid biologics, anything that might interest collectors in the inner systems. Marcus felt Nix's hand brush against his arm. A subtle warning. Can't say we've found much like that, he said. Pity. Zara completed their transaction with professional efficiency. Well, if you do come across anything interesting, I'll be back through in about 6 months, always willing to pay premium rates for truly unique items. They completed their business and returned to the shelter without incident. But Marcus could feel the weight of unspoken concerns settling between them. That evening, as they prepared dinner from their newly acquired supplies, Nix finally voiced what they were both thinking. She was fishing for information about me. Maybe, Marcus said carefully, or maybe she was just being thorough. Traders ask about unusual salvage all the time. Not like that. Nix set down her utensils and looked at him directly. She knew what to ask about. Hybrid biologics isn't standard trader terminology. Marcus felt cold dread settling in his stomach. You think someone's looking for you. It's possible. I was valuable property. And I disappeared rather suddenly. Nix's voice was calm, but he could see the tension in her shoulders. Some of my former owners had considerable resources. They sat in silence for a while, the implications of the conversation settling over them like a shadow. Marcus had always known that their peaceful isolation couldn't last forever, but he'd allowed himself to hope for more time. What do you want to do? He asked finally. Nix considered the question seriously. We have a few options. We could find transport off-world. Try to disappear somewhere in the inner systems. We could stay and hope I'm wrong about the trader's interest. Or, she paused, or we could leave Caliph, but on our own terms, build a life somewhere else. Somewhere we choose. She looked toward her small garden, where the alien plants continued to flourish in the pale sunlight. I've been thinking about what you said, about seeing the galaxy. Maybe it's time to find out what's beyond this place. The suggestion was both terrifying and exhilarating. Marcus had built his entire adult life around the illusion of safety that came from staying hidden, from avoiding attention and risk. But looking at Nix, seeing the strength she'd developed over their months together, the confidence that came from being truly free for the first time in her adult life, he realized that running away was just another form of prison. Where would we go? He asked. I don't know. Nix's smile was radiant with possibility. That's what makes it an adventure. They spent the following days making preparations. Marcus liquidated his accumulated salvage inventory, converting years of careful scavenging into portable credits. Nix carefully transplanted her strongest plants into portable containers, unwilling to abandon the first garden she'd ever grown. They researched shipping schedules and destination options, looking for a place that offered both anonymity and opportunity. The answer, when it came, was almost too perfect to be coincidence. An agricultural colony in the mid-reach was advertising for experienced terraforming consultants, particularly those with expertise in hybrid plant development. The work would be legitimate, challenging, and conducted on a world where questions about genetic heritage were less likely to arise. It's almost like the galaxy wants us to find each other, Nix said as they reviewed the job posting together. Maybe it does, Marcus replied. Or maybe we're just finally paying attention to the right opportunities. They booked passage on a freight hauler scheduled to depart within the week. On their last night in the shelter, they made love with a passion sharpened by transition and uncertainty, then lay awake talking about their hopes and fears for the future. Are you scared? Nix asked, her head resting on his shoulder. Terrified, Marcus admitted, but also excited, for the first time in years. I feel like I'm moving towards something instead of just running away. I love you, she said. Simply, I love you too. The morning of their departure dawned clear and cold, with the kind of crystalline light that made Calith's ruins look almost beautiful. They loaded their few possessions onto a transport cart and made their way to the landing field, where the freight hauler waited, its cargo holds already heavy with goods bound for the inner systems. As they climbed the boarding ramp, Marcus looked back at the settlement one final time. Somewhere in those ruins was the warehouse where he'd first heard Nix's whispered plea for help. Somewhere else was the shelter, where they'd learned to love each other. The places themselves would remain, slowly returning to the planet's embrace. But the life they'd built there would travel with them to whatever came next. Ready? Nix asked, taking his hand as the ship's engines began their pre-flight cycle. Marcus squeezed her fingers gently, feeling the warmth of her skin and the strength of her grip. Ready, the freight hauler lifted off smoothly, carrying them away. From Calith's gray skies toward the star-filled darkness of space, in the cargo hold, carefully secured among their other possessions, Nix's plants swayed gently with the ship's motion, their alien blossoms catching the artificial light like captured stars.